Hello, my name is Veronica Fibisan and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield and ASLE UKI postgraduate rep. I'm going to be talking to you about the lyric and the intertidal zone. Trapped between land and sea, the shoreline is a central space for the first-hand observation of adverse changes within the environment. The interaction between human and non-human spheres can yield interesting creative work, particularly in the realm of radical landscape poetry, such as that of Mark Dickinson, whose collections Literal and Tender Geometries I shall be focusing on in this paper alongside my series Quadrat. I will skip through Crutzen and Sturmer's proposed definition for the Anthropocene, as it is so well known, in favour of the Merriam-Webster one, which states that the Anthropocene is the period of time during which human activities have had an environmental impact on the Earth regarding as constituting a distinct geological age. Science, however, has yet to reach a consensus when it comes to establishing the start date, considering changes such as agriculture, rice production with large-scale environmental effects, and the domestication of animals, which predate the industrial era by at least 13,000 years, have caused just as many changes in the landscape. More recently, the appropriatedness of the term has been questioned, and also whether its association with climate change might further widen the gap within the human and non-human world. Based in Scarborough, Mark Dickinson is referred to by Amy Cutler as being an experimental literal writer. His first publication, Literal, sometimes regarded as a pamphlet, sometimes as a collection, is a unique find within the field of coastal radical landscape poetry. I will refer to it as a poem. Often overlooked by critics and hard to come by, Literal, subtitled In Zones of Shell and Leaves, is structured in 3 parts labelled as zones. Zone Inner Shore, Zone Middle Shore Interlude, and Zone Upper Shore, and contains a total of 30 passages titled with Roman numerals. This mode of structuring echoes the way in which the shoreline is scientifically divided between the lower, middle, and upper shore. Dickinson chooses to structure his poem as a crescendo, from the lower to the upper shore, as if he is emerging from the sea, almost like a mythical creature from under tides, movement filtering through pores, unquote. David Kidner begins his essay titled The Conceptual Assassination of Wilderness by stating that the tides of change are always harder to recognize when we ourselves are swept in the same direction as everything around us. This coastal fluidity, the sweeping back and forth of the tide, plays with the human perception and brings to light the limitations of anthropogenic senses. The intertidal zone is impossible to capture in its totality. It is this attempt that lies at the root of both Literal and, later on, Tender Geometries, and also the secondary attempt to bridge the human and non-human world through Dickinson's exploration of his own feral humanity. The hermit crab is the first creature to make an appearance within Literal. It is a crustacean whose body has adapted to living in the discarded shells of other creatures. Dickinson's hermit crab finds shelter in inner shore discard, and quote, creating a mirror image to the poet's retreat in the Coast Guard lookout, and tugging further at the strings of his feral humanity. For all we know, it may well look like this, with a discarded bottle cap or pipe as his home. This then becomes symbolic for anthropogenic changes on the shoreline and points at the primordial needs of creatures to find shelter. The poet, however, is out in the open, exposed and vulnerable. Echoing the intertidal fauna, he merges and blends into the environment, his creaturely nature allowing him to realize that the damage caused to the hermit crab's habitat will ultimately affect him in a cascading chain of events. The most obvious example being the presence of microplastics in the human body. At the end of the inner shore zone, the initial non-human presence of another crab seeking shelter has morphed into a crab enragé, pinned up against, checked into groove defense, active and ubiquitous, but most importantly now, caught under stone autotomy eject. The desperate act of the cornered crustacean illustrates the shift within the dynamic of the human-non-human relationship at the beginning of the poem, and also the conflict between this dichotomy. The silent suffering of the shoreline is ironically represented through the viscerality of an abandoned anchor, bleeding rust-red in rock pool. The reader is forewarned 2 pages in advance of the fate of the crab and its loss in front of the human hand, referred to in the third person, which breaks tension, surface ripple, interface to face, pulse to the microshore, crab in cover, held fast and on to, but bucket filled anyways, fish bait, and cycle. The bucket fills itself passively through the hyperseparation of the human sphere from the environment and the foraged crustaceans. The hand does not belong to anyone in particular in a recurring theme. The poet has symbolically relinquished his own limbs. These anthropogenic limbs are the force with which no individual in particular would like to associate himself. The evidence is found in the lyric I, which throughout the poem expresses guilt and regret, repeatedly prays and sings, in an attempt to bridge the human and non-human world. Dickinson's isolation in the Coast Guard lookout is only temporary, yet it has the feel of permanence, and in this instance anthropogenic shelter acts against the poet, by placing him above and away from the intertidal zone that he is trying to capture. This has the rigidity and geometry echoed in Dickinson's latest collection Tender Geometries, where his viewpoint is temporarily reduced to the Coast Guard lookout, as portrayed by the window on the cover of the collection, as well as this passage on the first page. The initial setting has him, seated beneath the stars and settled within the amphitheatre of a superstructure, applying the solution of time to the morning, hidden within the harmony of imperfect constitution, waiting passively for regularities. Divided between his inner outer spaces that surround him, both the Coast Guard lookout and the intertidal zone become places. The dualism marked by the Anthropocene is also present on the first page of Tender Geometries. Never fully reconciled, this human, that natural, centripetal faith, breaking apart the earth for a fresh field of the sky, linked by day. This is also anticipated in the last part of literal, where shaped geometries groove, disperse construction, gain lengthening through outspoke, rendering in times, place proportionate. However, nature responds by coming towards him through the presence of a creature commonly known as the rough periwinkle, which has adapted well to living in the splash zone and is slowly moving further inland. In literal, Dickinson marks this ongoing process. Here on the glistening grass, the shore is at a sheer drop-down, but the winkle may move ever upward, searching the next stage of development. This expansion towards the upper shore is also mentioned in Tender Geometries, in Dickinson's poem Threshold, in which every blade of grass is a singular wave, where the sea caresses inside, and the seeds waver, enduring before the threshold of succession. There is a sense of nostalgia and regret in front of the geological force of the human throughout literal, which alongside the incoming tide is swelling towards the end of the poem. Dickinson's helplessness, his inability to single-handedly halt the advancement of the Anthropocene and the incoming tide echo within these lines. I wish I'd never bothered fitting the marks, but rather sung in the simplest of fashion there at the tide mark. Trampling, one of the many ways of harming the shoreline, also causes the poet to feel guilty. Despite his desire not to harm the environment that he is exploring, he cannot help causing a degree of damage whilst doing fieldwork. This issue also perturbs others who conduct fieldwork, including myself. Since starting to conduct shore surveys for the Capturing Our Coast project run by the Marine Conservation Society, I have had the comforting thought that I am gathering data which is then entered into a global database used by scientists and researchers to monitor the numbers of coastal species of plants and animals, their distribution, and also identify any shifts in these patterns. The Quadrat Poems series, which I have recently started working on, involves using this scientific method of gathering data, taking the quadrat out of the water and placing the poem within it. Essentially, the quadrat is not trying to capture 1 square meter of the shoreline, but a much greater expanse of the landscape, and what it means to be immersing oneself in it for a particular amount of time. This is the first poem of the series. Quadrat 1. Growth Lines. Moule Marinier. 3 a.m. Tonamingly cold. Turn headlights to sea. A tide sinks back into the world. Prize mussels off the rocks. Hunt down the best beds. Molluscan settlements. Sleep and wake. Tidal world run. Its own rules. Boil seawater. Handful of herbs. Taste the entirety of a community. Legal, sustainable, underutilized, acidic water, valves turn brittle. Blanket rocky substrate, 10 pole byssus threads, stretched, bleached in tension. Anchored dots hold in place microscopic horizon. Concave cavities trap water at low tide, hinges firmly shut, doors to plenty. Toughness of a seafood supper, mankind versus mussel, forage, eat, cry. Share literal space, divide edible and toxic, borrow with no return. Teardrop-shaped chamber, bodies crushed by waves, mother of pearl walls. Wave stir, spoon stir, call it gourmet, call it what you will. Throw the shells back into the sea. Sense of injustice. Don't take too much. Leave for others and wildlife. Inhabitant. Pinoteres pisum, burrowed in shell, borrows hospitality. Klepto-parasite, your host grows to accommodate you. Dimorphic burrowed female, gonads, frozen saffron slithers beneath exoskeleton. Dactyls grip flesh, hold the world in place, braced for opening. Byssus threads trail, tails of dead selkies, torn, not released. Pea crab clashes, mussels stunted growth. Egg mass comes apart, nearly first Zea, escaped from the valves. Question symbiosis. Allied in nature, periopod and calipedes poised for attack. Pea crab feeds on string of food collected by the bivalve, eroding its gill surfaces. Crab borrows coast, guardian at the gate. Linnean nomenclature. Omnivore, predator, scavenger, shellfish tickler, luck bearer, ink blot patterns on carapace, read the future bound by innate alliance, blue-blooded casts into tidal scatterings, pairs coming together. Dickinson's feral humanity haunts him throughout the poem, in a series of contradictory emotions. The need for indoor protection versus the pull of the unknown outside world. The desire for conservation versus the necessity for exploration. And the euphoria of the discovery of the intertidal zone versus its devastating fragility and struggle for survival. Nearing the end of the poem, Dickinson's attempt at preservation crumbles under the weight of the anthropogenic force driving his actions. His experience is dulled by a series of events which follow in quick succession: the unknown, the anticipation of a discovery, the reveal, the familiarization, the contribution to knowledge, the attempt of restoration, the failure, the acceptance of failure, the guilt, the regret, and the coming to terms with his feral humanity. I have lifted up this rock, carefully de-sheltered, crab, winkle, anemone, and stone. I have replaced this shelter, carefully, crushing crab, winkle, anemone, beneath stone. There can be no epiphany, just a feeling of, well, being. This unfolding is also replicated in the way in which the text appears on the page. The poet's humanity seems to be slipping between his fingers. It is out of reach. This marks a strong contrast with the excitedness encountered in the first zone of literal, where hands dip freshly, pursue excitedly, encase around, then in they go. Within the last lines of literal, Dickinson undergoes a ritualistic rebirth from the sea, whilst providing the reader with a summary of what his work is, echoing the work of Peter Larkin. And I quote, "Encountering a coat of mail upon the rocks, I dreamt of lace, and sang a song peppered with salt chapped lips. I croaked, then drowned, and raised again, a Lazarus, to tides." The human is not only fully exposed to the elements and the sea, but drowns and is reborn through the abandonment of his anthropogenic shelter. Dickinson states that by being in the world, through an intimacy of a thorough immersion, poetry can radically re-engage with otherness, and begin to propagate alternative ways of seeing and occupying place, or at the very least remind us of the intimacy and otherness of our surroundings. Not by relocating the human body as the central process, but as a part of a process of being within and with the world." Unquote. I note here the use of the word radical. The tide is swelling and the sense of danger is heightened. Dickinson, alongside Larkin, writes, and I quote, "poetry which explores the commonality between the sacred and the wild, the corporeal and the temporal, and the perceptions which inhabit the disclosed and undisclosed things which occupy them." The poem culminates and ends with an ontological restructuring of the human and non-human within the environment that they both share. Dickinson's literal not only provides an account of his fieldwork and an exploration of his feral humanity, it spreads across time and tide, a journey that shows the dynamics and diversity of an apparently stilled space. Alongside tender geometries, it is a testimony to anthropogenic climate change, and it creates a bridge between the human and non-human world. Thank you.